Hey, welcome to week 3 of the Pepin Tote Sew Along, and this is where things get a little different if you are using the instructions from Making Magazine. They are the same, it's just in a different order so that we can work through the recessed zipper instructions. If you just want to follow along with the video instead of referencing the instructions in the pattern, just so you don't get mixed up on the order of things. All right, now we're going to take the two pocket pieces and place them right sides together, and we're going to sew along these two long edges. So they're right sides together. One of the pocket pieces is going to have the interfacing, one is not. So again, we're going to sew along each of the two long edges. Okay, here's the interior pocket. We've sewn the two edges and then we're going to press these seams open. That's my favorite way to do it. So I just kind of move the fabric so that I could get to that seam. Okay, then we're going to turn it right side out. And this is where I like to make sure that I am going to use the interfacing. That'll be the front side of the pocket. It'll be facing out in the lining. I'm going to go ahead and press these seams and then press the whole pocket again. If you need to, if you have kind of a wrinkly fabric like this Essex can kind of tend to be, just give it a little hit with the spray starch and press it again. We're going to top stitch along this one long edge, and that'll be the top edge of your pocket. If you'd like, you can go ahead and top stitch a second line of top stitching 1/4 inch below the previous top stitching. All right, so we've got the one main lining piece, and we're going to take the one long edge, that'll be our top edge, and we're going to place the completed interior pocket directly on top of that. Then we're going to measure down, that's in the pattern. And again, I use the same trick as I did before with the front pocket to get that nice and aligned. And then I'm going to pin it in place along these three edges, the sides and the bottom. Okay, so if you're following along from Making Magazine, that pocket placement is 2 1/4 inches from this top long edge of the main lining. It's not going to be the measurement in the Making Magazine. That's just the only difference here because we're assembling the pocket and attaching it before we're going to add that top lining piece. Okay, so the only other thing that I like to do before we take it over to the sewing machine is mark some divider lines. And usually I eyeball it when I'm sewing, but we'll just mark a few lines here. Okay, so we're going to take it over to the sewing machine and we're just going to baste along these edges, top stitch along this bottom edge, and then top stitch along these marked lines and make sure to back stitch and when you start and when you stop. Okay, I just wanted to take a minute and pause here and talk about the finishing of the lining. We're going to go 2 separate ways. I'll have a separate video for the recessed zipper part if you're using the recessed zipper, and if not, you can follow along with the rest of this video. So we're going to grab our top lining pieces and get started. Okay, so we're going to continue on with the lining method for just a regular tote with no recessed zipper. So we've got our top lining pieces, we've got 2 of them. I'm going to grab one and I'm going to place it right side down, matching up the long edges on here, and I'm going to pin that. And we're going to do the same thing for the remaining main lining piece and the remaining top lining piece. Place it right side down, lining up that top edge. And pin. Okay, so we have our 2 lining pieces, and we're going to take them and we're going to sew along these long edges. All right, so we're going to sew along this edge, and this is a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Just make doubly sure you're just doing a 1/4 inch. This is the only different seam allowance in the pattern, really. Okay, so now I'm going to take it over to my ironing board, and I'm going to press this seam in the back here toward that top lining. So I'm going to take it and press it up. Okay, so I have both main lining pieces pressed, seam allowance going toward that main lining, and we're going to top stitch along this top edge right on the top lining fabric. And we'll repeat that for the other lining piece. There you go. Now we're ready to install a magnetic snap if you choose to do so. So we've got the 4 parts for the magnetic snap, 2 the hardware and 2 the washers. I've got a couple scraps of SF101 and a couple scraps of fusible fleece. I've got a pencil, a seam gauge, and a sharp scissors. And of course I've got my main lining pieces. So I'm going to start by making my mark, and I'm going to just finger press this in half to find the center, and then this is 1.5 inches down is where I'm going to mark. And this may look off center to you, but remember we're going to have this 1/2 inch seam allowance up here when we assemble the bag at the end. I'm going to go ahead and mark the other piece now. The magnetic snap comes with a washer, and we're going to use that to mark the placement where we're going to cut the slits for the prongs. So there's these little slits here. I'm just going to mark those. Centering that previous marking in that center dot. That's what that's for. Get it aligned. And then I just take it and fold it in half. And you really want to make a very small slit. You can always make it bigger, but you can't make it smaller. So that's where I kind of err on the side of small. Just going to set one aside. And I'm going to take the one side of the magnetic snap, and I'm going to push the prongs through. Turn it over here. I grab my scraps of fusible here. Just going to cut tiny slits again. Slip those over the prongs, and then your washer goes over the prongs. Don't forget your washer. I've done that before. Bend your prongs out to the sides. Some people bend them in. For me, I've done it both ways. It doesn't really affect anything that I've noticed. Do whatever works for you. And then this last piece of SF101, I'm going to take it over to the ironing board, and I'm going to press that into place. Everything will fuse really nicely. So I'm going to set that aside, and we'll do the next half of the snap. Push those prongs through. Turn it over. And there we go. We'll take it over to the ironing board and fuse those in place. Okay, so we're on the home stretch of completing the lining, and we're going to place the 2 completed lining pieces right sides together, making sure all the edges are aligned. And when we go to pin, we're going to make sure that these 2 they match on both sides. And I'm going to go ahead and pin along the edges here. Okay, so once the sides and the bottom are pinned, we're going to take a ruler and a marking tool. I like a pencil here because it always shows up on the interfacing, and a sharp scissors. We're going to go ahead and mark these corners. The measurements are in the pattern. And then I like to use a scissors and cut those out, just like in the exterior assembly. Okay, so now we are going to get ready to sew. We're going to sew along these 2 sides and then along the bottom edge, but we're going to leave a gap here along the bottom for when we turn the bag right side out after we've sewn it together. That's about 8 to 9 inch opening here, so just leave that part unsewn. Another tip is for a nice snug lining, we're going to sew with a slightly larger seam allowance. We're going to use a 5/8 inch seam allowance here, and that'll give us a nice snug lining. Okay, and I forgot to mention that at this top edge, when we start sewing the lining, we're going to keep that at a 1/2 inch seam allowance so that when we put the lining and exterior together, those seams are going to match up nice. Okay, so the lining is sewn together. I'm going to take it over to the ironing board and I'm going to press open both the side seams and the bottom seam. Okay, so I've pressed the side seams and the bottom seam open, and I've got my hand in reaching through the tote, and we have the 2 seams we're going to match up. Those fabrics are going to be right sides together. We're going to match up the 2 seams, and then we're going to sew along this edge here with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And I'm going to repeat that for the other side, the other corner. Okay, so your corners are complete. There's that opening that I left. Those seams get pressed open as well. Okay, so our lining is almost complete. We're just going to trim these seam allowances on the corners to a 1/4 inch. Okay, so our lining is all set to go. We've got it all completed. You can leave it wrong side out like this. And I'll see you next week and we'll assemble the tote. Okay, so now we're at the part where we're going to get ready to install the recessed zipper. The first step is we're going to be bending these zipper tape ends so that there's a nice clean finish on the inside. The easiest for me is I just unzip it a little bit, and then when I've got the wrong side of the zipper facing up, I just bend these ends back on themselves like that, and then I just stitch really close to the edge of the zipper tape here, and I do that for both sides. Now if you wanted to, you can get kind of fancy, at least I feel like it's fancy, but you just bend it almost exactly back on itself and then fold this finished edge to meet that other folded edge, and then stitch right along that zipper tape end. And that would give you a finish that looked like that, like a little more squared off. And if I'll just do a visual here, if you can see, if you just bend it back, it gives it a slightly different look. So it's kind of up to you how you want to do it. But as long as we get that end, those ends finished so that they're going to be inserted into the lining, they're going to look nice. I'm going to take my zipper over and tack those in place. Okay, so now that I have the ends tacked in place, the other part to finish is the end. Again, if you saw the other video, I use a jacket zipper which has a finished end, and I just want to go over it. Some people have asked, like, I don't want to open and then separate. I don't want to have to deal with putting the zipper back together each time, but when it's installed, I usually only open it to about this point, because this end here that's finished is going to be tucked down into the lining. So you're not going to need to open it and reinsert it each time like you would a jacket, since I don't fully open it each time. So hopefully that makes sense. So I'm not going to need a zipper end tab on this, but if you are using a closed-ended zipper like this, has the zipper end stop right here, you're going to want to do a fabric end tab, and I've just done that here. So what you do first is you fold in these short ends to the wrong side by 1/2 inch, and then fold in each of those long sides by 1/2 inch, and then fold the whole thing in half. So this is great for a zipper that is 1 inch wide, but if you have a zipper, like a purse zipper like this, that's about 1 1/4 inches wide, you're going to want to get that to fit right. And I think it's kind of a fun detail, and I did this on my buckthorn totes, but what I did is I just folded these little ends back on themselves to kind of make it into almost like a V. And then I went ahead and I tacked it right here just on my sewing machine to hold those ends in place. So I'll go ahead and do that and then I'll show you the next part. Okay, so I've gone ahead and tacked that in place with my sewing machine. And then I take the zipper end tab and there's these kind of two open ends here between the folds. And I put my zipper end tape through one of those. I don't put it in between in the middle. I find that if I kind of have this one nice solid end, that it gives it a nice finish. And I try and put that so it faces like the top or the most visible part of the zipper. But I'll just quick clip it here. So that's kind of what that looks like. And then I would go ahead and sew along all four of the edges and just be really cautious about that zipper end stop, that metal bit there. So, but I think overall that is a really nice clean look. All right, so we're gonna get ready to put the zipper in. Now we've got it all prepared. I've got the one main lining piece with the pocket attached, right side facing up, and just double check that your pocket openings are on this side. If you don't want them to be, you don't want to get this bottom edge by mistake. Your pockets will be upside down. But what we're gonna do is we're gonna lay our zipper right side facing up. So you'll be able to open the zipper along this top long edge. And a couple measurements here is that I'm going to mark 1.5 inches away from this end. And that's where my zipper end stops, these little metal bits, these top ones. I'm going to align those to that marking. I'm not going to use the zipper tape for that reference, just the metal part. And then get that zipper tape edge aligned to the fabric. And then on this side, I'm going to make a marking on the zipper tape 1.5 inches from the edge of this fabric. And then I'm going to clip it in place. Okay, so now that's clipped in place, I'm going to take it over the machine and do a basting stitch 1/8 of an inch along this edge here. And I'm going to stop right at that marking and back stitch. It's okay to back stitch at both ends actually for this application. Okay, so that zipper is basted in place along that top edge there. And then I'm going to take my top lining piece, and since I didn't have interfacing on mine, you may have some on yours. And you can't really tell the right and wrong side on this fabric. I marked this wrong side so you could be sure to follow along. But the top lining piece is going to be wrong side facing up. And then I'm going to clip along this top edge. Okay, so I'm going to make a marking again on this end where the zipper is kind of extending past the side there. I'm going to mark within the seam allowance, just kind of a little dot 1.5 inches away. So when I'm sewing, I'm going to be starting here and then opening up that zipper to get past that point. Keep going. I'll close the zipper, sew, and I'm going to stop with my needle down right here, and then I'm going to bend this zipper in toward this way, this downward way, and then I'm going to continue sewing all the way to this edge. That's so this zipper tape edge doesn't get caught in this seam. We kind of want it to stay out of that seam after this point. We're going to be sewing at a 1/4 inch seam allowance for this seam, 1/4 inch. If you have a zipper that is not as wide, you're going to definitely need to lift your presser foot, slide this zipper open a few inches, and then what we're going to do is continue sewing, 1/4 inch seam allowance again. Then I'm going to stop with my needle down, lift my presser foot, and then close that zipper back up. So then you don't have to worry about working around that zipper pull. Okay, so now I have my needle down into the fabric at that marking that I marked earlier, and I'm going to lift my presser foot and then just angle that zipper away from that seam, put the presser foot back down, and then I'm going to continue sewing all the way to the edge. Okay, so that's what that looks like. So I've gone ahead and I've pressed this top lining piece up and away from the zipper, and so that seam allowance is facing up towards the top lining. I'm going to top stitch all the way across. There you go, and then just be sure that you're going to keep that zipper tape out of that seam. You don't want to catch that. So there, that is top stitched. All right, now we have the zipper installed. The top lining is top stitched in place. Now's the time to do the same steps to attach the zipper tape to the rest of the main lining and the other top lining piece. So we will take the main lining and we're going to place the zipper tape. So I've just taken that and kind of bent it back to expose that zipper tape edge. And we're going to align that to the top edge of the remaining main lining piece. And you want to make sure that these sides are aligned. That's kind of important to get that right. You could measure again. Again, that zipper end stop should be about 1.5 inches from this raw edge of the main lining, and then make a marking over here, 1.5 inches away from this fabric edge. Then I'll clip it in place. Okay, so this time we're going to be basting, and we're going to start at this marking. So we're going to use a 1/8 inch seam allowance to baste that zipper in place. And I just make sure that this zipper tape edge is aligned to that fabric. Sometimes it can kind of wiggle down. Okay, so the zipper's basted in place. All right, so the zipper's basted, and then we're going to place the remaining top lining piece wrong side facing up on top, getting it aligned to this top long edge. I'm going to go ahead and transfer that marking, that same marking, 1.5 inches, just so I know where to pull the zipper tape down from the outside there. Okay, and since we're starting on the opposite end as we did before, I'm going to put a little pin right at that marking so that I'm going to begin with bending that zipper out of the way this time instead of ending with it. And I just hold it with my fingers. You could try and pin it over that way too, whatever works. But again, sewing with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Okay, so the zipper is installed. That's super exciting. You can open it, close it. The next step here is to get these top lining pieces right sides together. The spot that I like to try and match here is this side seam. And then for the recessed zipper, you want to make sure that's bent in between the lining pieces. Still want to match that seam up if you can. And put a pin there. You can also pin this to the lining if that helps it stay out of the way. Just don't poke yourself when you're sewing. Done that. And then I'm going to mark that bottom corner that we're going to cut out. So now that we've got it cut out, the corners cut out, looks like we're all set here. So we're going to be sewing the side seams, and then along the bottom seam, you're going to just sew in a few inches and leave that middle portion open, and that's for turning the bag right side out. So what I like to do for the lining to get a nice snug fit is I start with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and then I kind of angle in here and increase it to about a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, so a little bit bigger, and that'll make the lining just a little bit tighter and fit better from the insides. So then I just do that on both sides here. I think that's it. The other part that you'll want to make sure is that you open that zipper. So you can get it from the top here. Just go ahead and open the top zipper. Get that out of the way as much as you can. If you're using wax canvas, you might want to leave this hole bigger rather than smaller. And when I get closer to this, where the zipper is, I can kind of feel it in there, and then I just always like to make sure to double check it's kind of down in that way. Finishing with the 1/2 inch seam allowance there at the top edge. So there we go. I don't know if you can see that. The zipper is in there. Maybe this is where you can see that the zipper end is tucked down into there. And I did pin it, so I gotta unpin it, but you won't be fully opening that zipper. You can, but you don't have to. So, all right, so the last step is to box the corners, just like on the exterior. I like to nest these seams, so this one with the pocket is kind of bulky, so it likes to bend one way or the other. And we're just going to align those two seams there. So the seam allowance for one side goes that direction, the seam allowance for this other side goes the opposite. Okay, corners are boxed, and you can just trim that seam allowance if you wish, and press this seam on the lining open too if you want. Okay, so our lining is all set to go. We've got it all completed. You can leave it wrong side out like this, and I'll see you next week and we'll assemble the tote.